So let's talk a little more about getting the diagnosis. You have had a variety of diagnoses with your children, some harder than others, and there's just those memories of evaluation and getting the diagnosis. I know for us it's captured in time as a still moment that lasted forever and that we'll never forget. But also those emotions that you feel and you never forget. What was that like for you?
You know, for us it was pretty positive, honestly. Again, we kind of look at it as a moment in time, just like you had mentioned, Harriet, and looking at, okay, how do we get this information and use this as one piece of our decision making to make, optimize our path moving forward. Sometimes it is hard to hear. There are some things that as a parent, you say, well, that's not fair, or that's not, that can't be right. But the delivery and the amount of time that the clinician takes, I think makes a lot of difference. And I know it's a challenge because everybody is different. Every family that walks through those doors is different. Some people might be angry or, absolutely rejecting it, that can't be it. And other times they're more accepting. In our case, we kind of knew sort of, the path we were on, or at least we felt like, we were on this path, and putting a label on it helps us to look forward, but it wasn't a shocking aha moment for us. It's not the day you hope for as a parent, for sure. It's not what you think of, as you're thinking about, let's start a family. But once you're there, you're there, and you gotta step up and, carry the load.
The way the diagnosis is delivered can make all the difference in the way a parent accepts, handles, chooses to move through that and become an advocate. I think that is just the paramount issue in how the diagnosis is delivered.
And when you get a wrong diagnosis or you don't accept it because it wasn't delivered well, then you're delayed. It sidetracks you for some period of time before you are able to go back in and revisit, what is going on and get back on track.
The critical moment in the feedback seems to be providing the actual diagnosis. Sometimes the family can be waiting for a really, really long time to kind of get that news. And like you mentioned, it can be a pretty emotional point in the evaluation. So there have to be so many different ways to approach this. And what do you think is the best way to go about providing that information?
Well, so I think generally, a lot of it is really about timing and trying to meet a family's needs. Many families are very anxious and they want to hear the diagnosis, and they're not going to hear a lot of what you have to say until they hear what the diagnosis is and what the final decision is, basically. On the other hand, it's hard to hear a lot of things after you've gotten that diagnosis too, because it's often a very difficult diagnosis for families to hear. So you have to kind of balance both those things. For me, what I like to make sure that I've covered before I get to the diagnosis is a little bit of a review, again, so parents do know what have we covered, who did it, why were we doing that, what were the questions, and then talking about a child's strengths, making sure that they have heard all the wonderful things we saw during this evaluation. Some of that might again be summarizing what parents have told us, and importantly things that we've actually seen and behaviors and skills we've seen during the evaluation. And then I pretty much get to it usually for most families. And it's always going to vary, and you have to use clinical judgment. So there will be some families who need to hear it even sooner than that, or who need much more of a kind of lead in to the various aspects of the evaluation, and even maybe, again, thinking about ASD, more explanation of what autism is and what we look for before we actually get to that. But I would say generally, most parents want to hear. So I cover those two key areas first, and then I kind of get there. And then I give parents a chance to process and have some feelings about that before we start talking more about the diagnosis.
It's interesting. I think we have evolved the same process without, necessarily trying to do it that way.
Yeah.
But I do always start off, when I sort of shift in my head to now we're in the feedback, I always tell the parent, okay, now we're in the feedback part of the program, and this is the part where, in general, you want to get the main idea of what I'm saying, and it's your chance to ask questions, but you don't have to memorize everything I'm saying, because you'll get a nice report later that will tell you all of these things. And that, puts a lot of parents who were poised with their pen and pencil, ready to write everything down, they relax a little bit and they think, okay, so I'm just going to absorb this. But then there really is always something cute or wonderful or surprising about the kid that you can appreciate with the parent in beginning the feedback. And I teach this to students too, because I think it helps the parent to know that we see the whole kid and we're not just ticking off symptoms. Either I tell them a cute thing that the kid said, or I appreciate how great the kid is to play with. He can really play. Something genuine. There's always something. And I think that is deeply appreciated by parents. And so that comes early. But then I'm like you. I start with the punchline, and I tell them that I'm going to do that, and then I say, and then we'll talk about how we get there. Because I agree, they're sitting on the edge of their seat sometimes, waiting, is it or isn't it? Are we going to get services or aren't we? Was I right or was I wrong to bring them in? And so I don't think you can leave them on the edge of their seat too long, except in certain cases when you need to be more delicate.
So hearing what you had to say made me think about a couple of other things too. So I agree with you. I let parents know about the report. Also, I usually have something to hand parents at the end of the session, whether it's a resource notebook or a short list of the diagnoses and a list of recommendations. So I let them know that. If I'm seeing a family for feedback and it's not the same day, I always like to check in and see how did things go from the time of the evaluation to the feedback session. Has anything changed? Anything I need to know about? And how are things for the child after the evaluation? Because it's a really long, hard day. And so I like to kind of check in about that as well. When I talk about strengths too, I also try to, besides talking about a child's strengths, I like to talk about the family strength. So I thank them for coming, and I acknowledge it's a hard thing to do, that a lot of families can't do what they did, which is bring their child in and have them evaluated and get to this process. And usually there are other things besides actually having been part of the evaluation process that a family's done that's been really helpful for their child. And I like to mention some family strengths before I go into the diagnosis as well.
That's nice.
Have you ever had an experience where the diagnosis was given to you and you were early enough in the process that you had an upwelling of emotion and actually cried? Tracy, you're looking at me in a way that tells me that you have had that experience.
Well, certainly to be given difficult news is never easy. And I think as parents, we're so invested in our children that yes. And I think a clinician's way of handling that can be really critical to the process. And if they reach over and maybe just, give you a touch on the shoulder to let you know that they're supportive of you, and that certainly this is difficult news, so it's natural that you might become emotional. So I think those kinds of things are ways to really support those hearing difficult things. This is not easy to hear or to deliver.
Or process.
Yes, true. And everyone processes differently. I'm thinking about parents.
No doubt about it.
Yeah.
It's such a vulnerable moment.
It is.
And so if you are feeling incredibly emotional, you can really feel exposed and raw. One of our clinicians was talking later about when it's really intense for a couple, for example, and they really need some time to process that together, and they're having that kind of response. that she will sometimes actually step out to give them a little privacy, which I think is being very, very sensitive to that moment. They can't always do that, but when the family really is obviously feeling a little raw at that moment, and they need to recover, and they need to do that with some privacy, then I think that's really respectful of her to do.
I do too, and that gives you an opportunity to kind of regroup and say, did you hear what I heard, and how is that resonating with you?
What do you do when, or if and when a parent starts to cry?
Well, for one thing, I let them cry, because I actually expect most families to cry. So it's something that really does happen a lot. We make sure that there's always tissues in the room, because parents may need that. And I give them permission to do that, and I say, it's okay. And then let that be an opening for them to tell me what they're feeling, what their concerns are, what questions they have, what's that brought up for them. So I let them do it. I don't go too quickly into, and I think this is another place where there actually could be, where feedback cannot go as well as you'd expect, to cut that off too quickly and start talking all about the diagnosis and why that diagnosis was made, or too quickly to comfort a parent either. We will do that. It's very important to do that, to emphasize strengths and let them know that there's good news in all this too, and there's reasons for optimism. But I give them a chance to be sad, because it's a tough diagnosis, and there's reasons to be sad.
I remember that being really hard when I was a new psychologist. The first couple of times parents cried, I felt like I was going to cry. It was, very hard to be with, but you do get more used to being with parents who are sad about a diagnosis, and then you can continue to support them without having to worry about yourself. And I think I agree. A lot, I don't know the numbers, but a lot of parents cry, certainly the majority. It's just an emotional thing to have your kid evaluated, and easy to do some blaming of yourself for anything that could be going on. And so, a piece of the reassurance that some people are really clear about is, so what we think is going on is this, and we do not think that, parents have a role in contributing to this diagnosis, or some people are very clear about that one. But I'm like you, I let parents cry. I don't react as if it's something awful. If parents acknowledge it themselves, if they, apologize for crying, I say, it's okay, a lot of people cry, it's fine. But then I don't move in to sort of explore a lot about what they're feeling, or because I think that my job really is to talk about the kid and to talk about what needs to get done, and that the parent can be a little bit derailed by too much empathy. And I think that a lot of parents can appreciate sort of my not focusing on their being sad, and can just accept it as, it's one of the things that people do. People smile, people cry, people sneeze, it's okay. And we can still move on with our feedback. But I probably wouldn't choose that moment to talk about doomsday prognostic information.
No, that's right. So it's really a balance. I mean, you want to give parents a chance to do that, but you're right, that can't be the whole rest of the feedback session, because there's other important information that's going to help a parent be able to cope more with the diagnosis and move forward that needs to happen. So you want to give parents some time for that, but then you do need to help them move on. And I think some of that ability to do that is by acknowledging the feelings first, providing some explicit reassurance. So I'm one of those people. I'd say, we know it's not what parents do, and in fact, look what you've already done. You've already done a lot, and it's clear. Look at the progress your child's made, or just the fact that you're here today is something that many parents can't do. You've done it. That's already going to have been very helpful for your child. And then to start to remind parents, it's a good place to say, remember I talked about those strengths, those were real. So we've got a diagnosis. It's a hard diagnosis. I understand that you're sad about that, but your child does have strengths, and we're going to talk about ways to move forward. This is a time now to acknowledge what he needs, to recognize his strengths, and think of ways to capitalize on his strengths while then meeting his needs. And I think those kinds of statements of, you were sad, but there's ways to move forward, and we're going to help you do that. We're going to help you figure out how to do that, then moves you on to that next phase.
Diagnosis is just, one small piece of information that relates to the all-encompassing path, that the child is on, and it's one piece that helps you make a future plan, but it doesn't change anything as far as the current status. I mean, the status 10 minutes before you get your evaluation and 10 minutes after is exactly the same. Child's the same. And so,
but your
I think if you
feelings
take it-
about it may be very, very different
Right.
before and after.
But for us, it was positive that it's additional information. We gather information to, try to make good decisions. So for us, even though sometimes it's hard to hear, in your mind, you really knew, that it's, the severity or the complexity of it, and then you use that as one more piece of information to move forward.
And I know for us, my daughter first started having evaluations soon after her first birthday. And due to her first evaluation and the feedback being such a positive experience, and they did talk a great deal about those things that she could do and the strengths that she had and those potential things that she had capability, that set up all the then difficult ones where we were talking about deficits and those weaknesses that she had. That very first one that enhanced her strengths spoke to my confidence in her, my confidence in myself, and competence in what we could kind of do together. So I think the initial feedback around strengths is probably the most critical thing you do, because you don't want parents to lose their sense of confidence and competence.
Even when you take all of these steps that you've mentioned, sometimes families just don't believe the diagnosis. What do you do when that happens?
Well, there's a couple things there. So it's really going to vary from family to family, and it's a great question. Hopefully that's not going to happen a lot, that all the things we've just been talking about and the way to conduct an evaluation and a feedback session will help lay that groundwork. But sometimes it's going to happen anyway. You've done everything you can and a family is just not ready. And then I think it's really going to vary. For some families it might mean stepping back and saying like, okay, well what else do we need to do? Oh, we didn't talk to such and such a person? Well, maybe we need to do that. We need to see your child again? Maybe we need to do that. Already a lot of time and energy has been put into an evaluation. My view is if a family needs another hour for an additional time for me to see their child or for me to talk to someone else, or if time permits, observe in the school or at least call the school or see a video, I'm going to do that so that all this other work is helpful and leads toward acceptance of a diagnosis. I think though sometimes you also have to think about other strategies. So for some families it might be we have already done all those things, or those things won't make the difference and the family's still going to have difficulty accepting a diagnosis, and then we need to think through why. I think it's important. It's a time when I'll think about cultural differences and how those might be impacting things, and if there's another way for me to think about this, or who else I can get involved in the feedback session. Maybe a key person who needs to be there to help this family isn't there, so maybe we need another session, or we need to involve someone else. It may also be, I need to say that depending on how a family says, I don't accept this and I don't believe this, where that is, it might not matter that much. As if a family's ready to take recommendations and go with where we as a team, or if I'm working individually as a psychologist, think they need to go, I don't know that they need to say, oh, and you're so right, it's just this. And I'll actually sometimes have that conversation with a family in a very direct way. After all, we've just been saying it's just a label. What's important is meeting a child's needs and deciding what are the next steps we need to take, how to help that child. So if a family is willing to do all those things and they say, I'm going to do everything you tell me to do, but I don't believe it, I don't think that's why, I don't like it, I don't believe it, I will say, that's fine. That's great. We're basically thinking the same way, because I don't think the label's that important either. What's important is what you do next. So it can go from, we're going to do all these other things that we need to do to help you accept this diagnosis, to, that's fine, that's great. We both agree on next steps. We'll just go from there. So
That's exactly what I was going to say. Does it matter if they believe you or not?
Right.
Because if they're already hooked up with lots of interventions, I don't need to be right for the kid to get better. And so if the kid is doing well and continuing to make progress, it doesn't matter to me whether I'm right or wrong according to the parent. But if the parent feels unhappy with not knowing whether the diagnosis is right or wrong, then I would hope that I could continue to be helpful to that family and maybe help them to find a second opinion. I think in an area that wasn't my area of specialty, I might very well seek a second opinion.
It's a great idea.
And it's, their prerogative to do that. And I'd hope that I could continue to help them in pursuing that if that's what they need next.
It brings up another good point, which is that we've been talking about families accepting or not accepting a diagnosis, but sometimes it's one member of the family. And then I think sometimes that same process needs to happen, where you think about, well, what can we do next? What needs to happen? And sometimes it doesn't need to happen, because that other family member, the one who disagrees with the diagnosis, is still willing to have the family members who do agree move forward. But I wanted to mention that because sometimes that discussion is important to have with a family, where that family can hear just what we've said about, like, that's okay. It's okay if your husband disagrees or if your wife disagrees. If they're supportive of you and they're willing to do the things that you think are important to be done and that we've recommended, let that person go at their own pace in accepting the diagnosis. So I think some education for families around that, and that can often happen both between spouses, or it can be a generational issue that often comes up. And I think having family members who are wanting other people to agree with them or accept the diagnosis, it's a helpful piece to explain.
I still think that would be a pretty difficult thing to deal with. So how often do you think that actually happens?
I don't think it happens very often, and especially as you learn how to give feedback and you learn how to do the kinds of techniques that we're talking about, I don't think it happens very often. I think the other piece of that, though, that's probably important, especially for students and people starting out, is to be a little more objective about that and a little less defensive about it. So there'll be things to learn, because oftentimes if a feedback doesn't go well, there are things to look back on, and I've certainly done that. Thought, well, maybe if I'd done this instead, it would have gone better. So you learn, and maybe that's something you can even talk with the family about and repair, or certainly then carry it on for the next family who will benefit from that. But also for some families, it's just really difficult no matter what you've done. And so you need to be less defensive about that, be professional about that, try to help the family, and not take it personally. I think that's another place where things could go wrong in feedback. If you feel like, I've done all this work and I did a good job and I did everything everyone told me to do, and you're not believing what I said, and you should. So something, we have to fix this. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe that's just the process, and you've done a great job, and even if you had some things you would do differently, that's okay too. You have to let this family accept things at their pace and at the rate they're going. And I think that helps too, because I do think families can pick up on a feeling of, oh no, I gave you this diagnosis, you need to say yes, as opposed to the stance we were just taking of, like, that's okay, you don't have to agree.
And I would agree, it doesn't happen to me very often that I know about, and I hope that I would know.
That's a good point.
We don't always check in afterward, but I can only think of a couple of times when the parent was just rejecting of a diagnosis or of my findings, and one was when I was very new at this job, and the second one was more recent, but that was a parent who couldn't tolerate observing for whatever reason, just kind of refused all opportunities that were presented to observe. And so, probably it was a pretty difficult thing for that parent to even think about there being difficulties in any of these areas. And in that case, I was able to help them to find a good provider who could maybe provide a second opinion. And so I hope that I at least laid the groundwork for the second provider who, may or may not have different findings.
Well, that's a great point, and I think that's another thing you could keep in mind if you have a feedback that hasn't quite gone the way you want, is that you probably have laid the groundwork for the next person, even if you can't directly make that referral. So sometimes we're in the position of we're the ones making that second opinion, or we're evaluating someone where someone else had the hard job of saying, I think you better have your child evaluated for an autism spectrum disorder. It's a tough position to be in. We're then in that position of saying, like, okay, we agree. It was good that you brought your child in. But sometimes we might be on the other end of, for whatever reason, we're the first people saying it, and that family's not ready to hear that yet. Again, no fault of ours, no fault of theirs. It's just where they are in the process. But you know that you've been honest and direct. You've provided a good experience for the family and the child, and when they go to the next person, who will then most likely confirm your diagnosis. That family's heard it. They're going to be able to go to another person and have that evaluation, and then maybe they'll accept it. So sometimes thinking through where you might be in a family's process can help with that too.
So it seems like this part of the feedback can go really differently for each family. And so what I've heard you say so far is that it's really important to really include the family as part of the evaluation from the very beginning, and make sure that you're constantly thinking about the feedback and how that's going to go from the start of the evaluation. And I guess you also mentioned that it's been really important to be as transparent as you possibly can, and tell the family what it is that you're doing and why it is that you're doing that, and starting off the feedback session with the strengths, and letting them know that they are going to be receiving a report, so that they can just try and sit there and then process as much information as possible. And you also mentioned that really starting off with the punchline or the bottom line is the way to go, and providing as much empathy as the family needs are really important components up until this point. So are there other things that you think are really important to remember?
I think you've really done a nice job of summarizing the key points of where we are in the process of talking about feedback.